Is there a Cub fan in the house? Anyone out there want to go to the moon? I'm in the right place. I guess I'm in the right place. I'll try and take you to the moon with a series of slides here pretty quickly. But I do appreciate having the opportunity to be here. I particularly want to thank Dr. Letterman and Dr. Marshall for their kind invitation and opportunity to get a chance to talk and meet many of you young students out there. And I want to congratulate all of you who are here, all of you who are going to this academy, IMSA, those of you who are from other schools around the Chicago area because of what you have done in the field and world of academics. I want to particularly mention Roosevelt Elementary School, middle school from Bellwood, Illinois, because that's where I grew up. And I went to a school called McKinley, which is not too far down the block from Bellwood, and we used to punch each other out in basketball all the time. Remember that. But I want to welcome you here. I'm glad to see your accomplishments. I think that's very, very important. I also want to thank Mr. Burke for that kind and illustrious introduction. I'm not sure I deserve it. You know, you stand up here and sometimes people make you feel like something you're not sure you really are, and that's a hero. But I'm going to tell you a quick story about my daughter when she was a young girl, a story that truly brought me down to earth very, very quickly at the time. When I flew the first time, she was 3 years old. And 3 is not old enough to remember, and it certainly is not old enough to care. When I flew the third time, on my second trip to the moon, she was 9. She was very much a part of her daddy's flight to the moon. Matter of fact, I remember one time she was on the Today Show, and it was Jim Hartz, who was the host of the Today Show on NBC, asked her if she thought her daddy would find water on the moon, and she said, well, if he does, I think he went to the wrong place. But 6 years old, during my first flight to the moon, Apollo 10, is old enough to remember and old enough to care, but sometimes too busy to worry about it. And that's the story I want to tell real quickly. I took my daughter Tracy out in the backyard down in Houston, Texas. Yeah, I'm an Astro fan now, but I was a Cub fan most of my life. But I took her down in the backyard down in Houston, Texas, about a month before we went to the moon, and I wanted her to maybe remember the fact that her daddy was going to go to the moon, do something different. And I said, Tracy, do you know how far away the moon is? And she says, Daddy, the moon is. I said, Tracy, the moon is way, way far away in the sky, out there as far as the stars are. And I said, Tracy, do you know who's going to the moon? And she says, Daddy, you and Mr. Stafford. I said, Tracy, your daddy, Mr. Stafford, and John Young are going to go to the moon. And I said, you know what we're going to fly? She said, Daddy, you're going to fly Snoop. I said, Tracy, your daddy is going to fly Snoopy, and we're going to go closer to the moon than anyone's ever been before. This conversation went on for a while, and I asked a number of questions before my poor little 6-year-old could answer them, even if she knew the answers. I guess I was too excited, and I wanted to tell her what her daddy was going to do. And all of a sudden, it got quiet. And I knew she had a question, and I thought, well, this is show and tell. You all remember first grade. We were all there at one time or another. This is show and tell in first grade. This is the week I'm going to be hero on the block. And you've got to understand, this is absolutely true. When your daughter goes to school with the likes of Neil Armstrong's children, Mike Collins' children, Alan Bean's children, Buzz Aldrin's children, Jim McDivitt's children, going to the moon for a 6-year-old at that point in her life just ain't any big deal. But this was important to me. I was going to be show and tell tomorrow morning in school. And this is after I came back. I asked her all these questions. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. I asked her all these questions, and she didn't have any answers, and I got too excited. I went to the moon, came back, and then I started asking the same questions. I said, Tracy, do you know what that is? And she said, Daddy, that's the moon, and the moon is way, way far away in the sky where God lives. And Tracy, do you know? And Daddy, you and Mr. Stafford flew Sloopy closer to the moon than anyone else has ever flown before. And I asked the questions. I thought maybe she had all the answers. I thought maybe her mother briefed her pretty well, and I guess maybe she did as well. That's when it got quiet. I said, I got ahead of myself a minute. That's when it got quiet. And she looks up at me and says, Daddy, and I said, what, punk? And that's the moment I thought I was going to be the big hero on the block. And she says, now that you've been to the moon and back, when are you going to take me camping like you promised? Truly did bring me down to earth in a hurry and made me realize that that hero stuff only goes so far. What I do realize today is I'm talking to a whole new generation of young men and young women. It's this December, it'll be 31 years since we, this country of ours, made those final steps on the surface of the moon. 31 years, long before you were born. As a matter of fact, in many cases, your parents probably were in diapers or at best in knee pants back then when we went to the moon back in 1972. So I want to do a couple things today. I want to not only take you back on a journey in time to tell you what we did, but I want you to understand a little bit about what the challenge of the times were and why we did it and how we did it as well. And I think that's very, very important because sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. And I think the key to having gone to the moon is the circumstances and an environment in which we went to the moon. And I'd like to share that with you. And along the way, you're going to hear words from me probably over and over again, words like challenge and commitment and dedication and vision, self-sacrifice and passion. And these are all words that if you haven't already confronted, and I'm sure those of you who have, here at IMSA have already confronted head on, you certainly will throughout the rest of your life. And they're words you got to consider the significance and the importance of, I think, in life to get done what you want to get done and to become what you want to become, whatever that may be. What I'm going to do first, very, very quickly, is run you through, and I could take a lot of time in these slides. I'm just going to take you on a quick trip to the moon, not going to spend nearly as much time as I'd like to from the launch to the return, and then we'll get in and we'll start sharing some of the feelings and thoughts that I had on my journey. Will the lights go off when I press this button? You betcha, it's magic. I don't know if you can all see, but I'll try and stay out of your way. This is a badge of our flight. Every flight to the moon wants to have an identity. We all want to belong to something. This is the badge, or what we call a patch, or the emblem of Apollo 17. And we wanted to capture three things. We wanted to capture mankind with all his wisdom and all his intelligence. We didn't send robots. We sent human beings. We sent intelligent human beings to the moon to make the decisions that only intelligent human beings could make in certain situations. So we selected the bust of Apollo to represent mankind. And if you notice, the bust of Apollo is looking into the future. The future is represented by the stars and by the planets and by the endlessness of the universe. And you will see a modern, what we call a modern-day American eagle. Its wing just touches the edge of the moon, saying we will take what we learned from having gone to the moon and we will lead mankind into the future. And that was the significance of our patch. This is our crew. About a month before we went to the moon, big Saturn V is behind it, 38 stories high. This being the last flight, we had a geologist in the space program, and the decision was made that, by golly, we're not going to end the space program without taking a lunar geologist to the moon. Jack Schmidt is up there in the left top center. He was the only scientist ever to fly an Apollo. He was not an aviator. We taught him to fly as best we could, but he literally added tremendously to our flight. And between his capability to understand the details of the moon and I studied so much geology myself, and my ability to stand back and look at the big picture, we painted a pretty complete picture of the moon at that point in Apollo 17. The other gentleman, the bald-headed gentleman, is another naval aviator. He had flown combat missions in Vietnam, and he was my command module pilot. And that is our training lunar Lunar Rover, we drove on the moon. And it was a tremendous, tremendous device. This is our big Saturn V. You can see our target back there. It wasn't quite that visible as we went, but it was an enormous, enormous vehicle. It doesn't exist today, but it took us to another planet, the Saturn V. I'm going through these very quickly. Well, I was going through them quickly. There you are. That's the night launch. Apollo 17 was the first and only night launch ever in the Apollo program. And someone said it was like the sun lit up from without, 1,000 suns, instantaneous light. Why did we go at night? Because in order to get to the landing site we wanted to land on Apollo 17, which was no longer one of those, if you will, simple sites on the equator, the easy place to get to, we had to go to north latitudes and very eastern longitudes on the moon, the northeast corner of the moon, which had never been visited before. The only way we could get there in the month of December to get the sun at our back when we landed was to launch at night. This is what it looked like from Orlando, Florida. Someone took a time capsule, or time picture, and that was our arc through the sky. And I've had many people, in fact, this one just last weekend told me he was in Miami and watched us launch all the way up at Kennedy Space Center. People from South North Carolina, all the way down the coast could see this launch at nighttime. We launched in Earth orbit, and as soon as we launched in Earth orbit, went around, checked the spacecraft out, 25,000 miles, or 18,000 miles an hour, accelerated to 25,000 miles, headed on out. And I'm going to talk more about this, so remember these next 2 or 3 pictures. And we headed on out, and once we got everything where we wanted it to go and we were on our way, we turned around and looked back at the Earth. This is a very interesting part of the Earth. This is the Middle East right now, and that's Africa, Saudi Arabia, the Indian Ocean down at the right, Mediterranean at the top. Remember the curvature of the Earth as you see it in these pictures, because I'm going to refer to it again. This is the same picture, the Earth, obviously, on our way out. This is probably some 30,000 miles out, but the Earth had made one complete revolution. It wasn't stationary. We were headed out, and it was rotating beneath us. So we had already seen the other side of the world. And now we're looking at, in December, the entirety of the Antarctic continent down there, which is broken away from the ice caps, the continent of Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean. You see this picture, by the way, in everybody's travel folders and everybody who uses the word global in their advertising. This picture, they tell me, is the most sought after and used picture of anything that's ever been taken during the entire Apollo program. Okay, this is not too many hours later, 12 to be exact, and we're still on our way, and we're looking at the other side of the world. There's a Pacific Ocean to the left. We're looking at North America, Baja California. Up there on top is the North Pole and Alaska under those clouds. We can follow it. You can't probably see it too well from there. You could actually follow down through Panama and the northern part of North America, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic Ocean's on the right. And notice something is happening. The Terminator, the sunset, is slowly moving across the Earth. And the Earth, remember, rotates once every 24 hours through that Terminator. The sun is slowly progressing across the Earth. Very quickly, if we're on Earth and we look at a new moon, what do we see? We really see nothing. But if you're on the moon and looking back at the Earth, you see a full Earth. When we're on Earth and we look at a full moon, if you're on the moon, you'd be looking at a dark Earth. And so if you see a quarter of a moon, like I think we can see out there tonight, a quarter of a moon, if you are on the moon, you'd be seeing 3/4 of an Earth. The Terminator slowly, as the days of the month progress, the Terminator moves across the Earth. This is our first sight of our destination. 3 days, and we never saw where we were headed. We were headed out of 25,000 miles to miss this moon by 50 miles, a quarter of a million miles away. And that was our first glimpse of the moon. Pretty, well, certainly it's mysterious, almost looks like science fiction, obviously inhabitable, not too friendly, but believe me, it became very, very friendly after a period of time. This is our lunar module. It's upside down. Those legs are what we landed on. And in space, there's no up, there's no down. So when we undocked, I'm in that vehicle. This picture was being taken by Ron Evans. It's got an ascent stage down at the bottom, descent stage with an engine up, a landing engine on the top. It actually separates into two pieces, and I'll show it to you. We use the bottom section to land with, and then as a launching platform. As I say, I'm going through these pretty quickly. This is the area which we landed, a very mountainous area on the moon. That valley that you're looking at, well, I've got right here. This valley you're looking at right here is where we landed. And that's a landslide in this particular area on the moon, and we landed right about in there. Okay, this is one of the first things we did when we got to the moon was plant the American flag, and it truly was a very proud moment. We didn't do it as we weren't claiming the moon or this valley for our country. This was our way of saying thank you for thousands and thousands of people who made those steps that all of us took on the moon possible. You can see how dirty you get from the dust. The lunar dust is like graphite, and every time you step, remember there's no atmosphere on the moon, and there's no, and there's 1/6 gravity, so you kick that dust, it goes everywhere, and it got into everything. Those of you who are big baseball or football or golf fans, you know, you can't hook or slice on the moon. How about that? There's no air, you can't hook or slice. You can hit a golf ball probably in the orbit. Al Shepard tried it, but with that big spacesuit he was wearing, he didn't quite get in orbit. But it's a very interesting environment. You get accustomed to zero gravity, or to 1/6 gravity very quickly. There's our Lunar Rover, real Lunar Rover. Didn't have rubber tires. It didn't need rubber tires. So we had piano wire woven into a tire. Worked very good, and that's a stripped-down version of the Lunar Rover. We put a lot of equipment on it, and it was a tremendous device. I remember long time ago, about the time I first got in the space program, I had a chance to meet Dr. Wernher von Braun. And we sat in at a dinner table, and I was a rookie astronaut, never even flown. And he said, "Don't you worry about how you're going to get to the moon. I will get you there." He said, "You worry about what you do when you get there. Someday, Gene, you're going to drive a car on the moon." I said, "Yes, sir, Dr. von Braun." That was in 1965. 1972, I drove a car on the moon. This is another picture of us working. You see how the kind of footprints we make in the sand. This is around our landing site because the flag is there. That's the antenna, some of the equipment we put on a Lunar Rover. Someone said this is your John Wayne photo because I'm ready, quick draw my 6 guns. Gives you an idea. Here's the Lunar Rover. That was our home on the moon. That's what it looks like after you land. This is a big boulder about literally about 3 stories high. That's Jack Schmidt down there on the right. There's I had to reach way over my head to take that little sample of soil right there back. And the lunar module, I know you're not going to see it, but I'm going to point out, it's just that when we landed, we blew up some dust, and underneath the cosmic radiation dust on the surface, it was white. And our lunar module sits right in there. It's just a speck. You can't, no bigger than that little laser dot I'm showing you. This gives you a real idea of the valley we landed in. There is our lunar module right there. Oh, we're several miles away. There's the big massifs, or the big mountains on one side that went up. You can see it was flooded here by a lava flow at one time, and you can see the gradual slope of this entire valley. You know, if I'd seen this picture before I went, it could seem like it was a very lonely place. But it was very interesting. This gives you a real perspective of what the valley was like. Okay, here's just another picture working around the Lunar Rover. Now we've got all our equipment. You can see how valuable that Lunar Rover was. And I'm sorry that I'm standing in your way over there. But you can see how valuable that Lunar Rover was with all the equipment we had to put on it. Oh, I'm the only car within 250,000 miles away, and I knocked the fender off. Now, General Motors and Boeing together built this vehicle, and the president of General Motors became a good friend of mine, and I sent him this picture because he used to really get on me about knocking a fender off his car. And we actually repaired that fender with geology maps because we had to keep the dust from rooster tailing. That's why the fenders were very important. So I sent him this picture. And I put on there, I said, his name was Jim McDonald. Dear Jim, where was that 24-hour roadside assistance when I really needed it? This is taken from inside the lunar module, which was literally our home on the moon. You can see all the footprints. You can see all the tracks, and we're surrounded by these mountains. They're in all directions. These are little rocket engines we use to control our attitude. This is one of my favorite pictures I took of Jack Schmidt. I was able to take that Hasselblad camera, hold it between my legs, because our suits were very stiff. I just held it upside down between my legs. I wanted to get man, I wanted to get country, and I wanted to get the earth all in the same picture. And not only did I do that, in a reflection, I got a little bit of the moon and myself in this picture, so it's all right there. One of my very favorite pictures. And this is what the modern day lunar explorer looks like when you get back in the spacecraft. Pretty dirty, pretty tired. Of course, we could take our helmets off because we pressurized our spacecraft. It was very, very small. And this is about when we were about ready to lift off. This is when we fired the engine, separated the top section from the bottom section, and everything flew out. And this is about a second later, and we're on our way. We're on our way to rendezvous with the mothership, which has been going around in orbit around the moon, conducting its own scientific experiments. Come up from around behind. You've seen this picture before. It was the first seen, and a picture brought home on Apollo 8. It's called Earthrise. Earthrise over the lunar horizon. I believe it has truly changed the way we look at ourselves. This is a picture of the Earth rising over the horizon of another, if you will, body or planet in this universe. And it's something you can see now, before we started back, how the Terminator has crept across the surface of the Earth, because it's several days later. And you saw full Earth when we left, and this is what we were shooting for when we came back. And there's our command module that was in orbit. There's just he did a lot of experiments, looked for water with special cameras and radar devices and so forth. And that's our mothership. That's what we needed to come home with. This section down here is what we land with, we come through the atmosphere with. This is where all our equipment, oxygen, and rocket engine is. This is a section like this on Apollo 13, where the oxygen tank blew up and disabled their spacecraft. Here's our lunar module. This is all that comes back. We had a little ascent engine to get off the surface right here. Little windows. We actually stood up. If it looks like it's made out of cellophane, it almost is. Cellophane and titanium, and between you and the vacuum of space, the infinity, if you will, of space and time was a sheet of titanium about that thick, and when you got in the spacecraft and pressurized it with oxygen, you were like on the inside of an oil can. It went bloop like this, and it just, the hatch would just lean outward. Very comforting thought. And here's what it looks like when we come home. That's all that's left of that big Saturn V, that big 38-story building, 3 parachutes. John Young was asked one time, what's the most beautiful sight in all of space flight? And some of us tend to get a little nostalgic and philosophical about it, and he's a great one-liner. He said the parachutes. He had something there. It was a pretty sight. Here's where we came home. I logged this. I'm a naval aviator. I logged this as a carrier landing because we came so close to the Ticonderoga, I figured they owed that much to me. And here's what the spacecraft looked like when we came back. The frogmen came in, and I think that is the last picture in that group. And end of slide checklist. Okay, there. I don't know if we can leave that one on or not. Now, I just want you to take you on that quick trip. You can remember a couple of those pictures. Now let me take you on that real journey back in time. We are standing, and I think you're all very lucky because we're standing on the threshold of the 21st century. This is 100th anniversary, the Centennial of Flight. It's 100 years this December since Orville and Wilbur Wright lifted off in power flight from Kitty Hawk. A lot's happened in that 100 years. We can fly around the world in less time than it took Lindbergh to fly across the oceans. We can go to the moon. We can do so many other things, and so many things have happened in that time frame. during the lifetime of your parents and grandparents, that when you start really studying history, you're going to find that you have one heck of a challenge ahead of you to make the next century, to open the doors for your children and your grandchildren, to make the next century as challenging. We have to realize, though, that it's been over 4 decades, 40 years, since a young American president, I know you all remember the name of John F. Kennedy, literally startled the entire world with an astonishing proclamation that this nation, the United States of America, would land a man on the moon and do the other things. And he said we would do them not because they were easy, but because they were hard. He went on to say that it would take an entire nation of people, it would take all of us at that time to put that man on the surface of the moon. And he was talking about your parents and your aunts and your uncles and your grandparents. These are the people, when he said it will take all of us, an entire nation of people, to put him there. And that it would not be without sacrifice. And something we talked about this morning in a number of classrooms, it would not be without risk. How prophetic his words did become over time. Perhaps no greater challenge, certainly in my lifetime, or maybe in the history of modern man, ever confronted us all. I often wonder, when I think back, whether JFK was a visionary, whether he was a dreamer, or whether he was politically astute. He was most likely he was all three. But unfortunately, we'll never know, nor will we ever really fully know whether he fully understand himself, fully appreciated the significance of that commitment he thrust upon us. Because with that dramatic challenge to the people of this nation of ours, he did in fact challenge us beyond our endless dreams and beyond our wildest imaginations. And I know I'm taking you back. Anything that happened before you were born, I accept the fact that, it might have just as well been around Columbus's time. But this has happened in a generation that preceded you. Your parents and grandparents were part of this. So I think it's something you need to at least be aware of. So he did challenge the nation, these people of this country of ours, beyond our endless dreams and wildest imagination. He challenged us to do what mankind had only dreamed about doing for eons and eons of time, and that was venturing to the stars. He challenged our spirit, he challenged our pride, and certainly he challenged our industrial and technological might of the time, of the 60s. He challenged us to do, and many of you will remember this, he challenged us to do what most thought was impossible. But most important, at that point in time, he challenged our commitment as a nation to the future. A commitment that led to human beings leaving this planet for the first time. And we didn't just leave physically. I think we left philosophically. We left spiritually as well. And that commitment was called by many the greatest technological endeavor in the history of mankind, and it may very well have been, at least in modern mankind, because you don't have to go far. Your hospitals, your classrooms, you got more technology, more computing power on a dashboard of your automobile than we had to go to the moon. Look around you, look everywhere. Your cell phones, how did the world exist without cell phones? It was a tremendous technological endeavor. But I think it's far more important, more significantly, it was perhaps one of the greatest human endeavors in the history of mankind. And I'm talking about a human endeavor, not of a chosen few of us who had a chance to walk in space or call the moon our home, but rather of a team of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And I mentioned them a minute ago, your parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, all of those who preceded you, all who were dedicated individually and collectively and committed to a goal deemed by many at the time unattainable. Going to the moon? Unattainable. And I'm going to put that in the right frame of time in a moment. It was a goal that required this nation to reach further than we've ever reached before in our modern history. It was a human endeavor we now know as Apollo required the vision of a president, the efforts, the courage, the self-sacrifice, the unswerving dedication of an entire nation of people, exactly as JFK said it would do. It was a nation of people who overcame the tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire, a fire that happened back in 1967, a fire that claimed the lives of 3 of my colleagues, my personal friends, in an Apollo spaceship before we ever got an Apollo spaceship off the ground. It was an event that I believe would have deterred a lesser people. We knew, and we know today in space, that we're vulnerable to a whole host of problems over which we have no control. Although we think we're invincible and invulnerable, we do accept the fact that there are things that can happen over which we have no control. And I remember at Arlington Cemetery in Washington burying my friends. And I wasn't sure whether we were burying the entire Apollo program before it ever began, or whether we were just burying 3 of our colleagues. But that event not only rekindled our spirit and gave us more impetus to succeed, it truly inspired us beyond anything. We paid the price, but it inspired us beyond anything else that might have happened along the way to the moon. And this nation of people of which I speak was a nation of people who would just not give up during Apollo 13. And I know probably all of you have seen that movie. And maybe you saw the History Channel the other day about failure is not an option. Notwithstanding, and you know, that was the attitude. But words come easy sometimes. Let me tell you, failure is not an option, but we still came closer than any of us even realized at the time of losing 3 human beings to the endlessness and the eternity of space. We had dinner with Jim Lovell last night, as normal as you and I. I've tried to project myself, even though I went to the moon before and after Jim, to project myself into the environment that he inherited in Apollo 13, and it was very, very difficult. But this nation of people of which I speak that accomplished the impossible are a nation of people who made all the steps that any one of us ever took on the moon even possible. There's an old saying that goes, technology makes things possible, but it's people that make things happen. Technology makes things possible, but it's people who take that technology and use it to their advantage to make things happen. It was a human endeavor of immense proportions, unmatched, I believe, in modern history, by those, and here's the real key, by those who dared to dream, by those people who dared to dream, by those people who dared, who had the audacity to reach out further than they could grasp, and by those who were not deterred by failure nor afraid to try, and by those who together just quite frankly didn't know it couldn't be done. Let me say that again, because I think it's important to us individually as well. We were able to go to the moon. We were able to accomplish the impossible. We were able to meet the challenge of our president because we had a nation of people who dared to dream, who dared to live their dreams, who dared to do the impossible, to reach further. You know, don't say I can't. I can, I will. By those who weren't afraid to make a mistake, and we paid for our mistakes dearly. But we learned from those mistakes, and we were not deterred by failure, but so we continued to try and try and try again. And it was made possible by those who just didn't know it couldn't be done. Don't tell me I can't do it, because that's going to inspire me to do it. And therein, I think, lies the real legacy that you have inherited, the real essence of Apollo. It's not the moon rocks. Scientifically, they're important, but it's the spirit of Apollo, I think, which is important for you to remember as you individually challenge the future. Now, let me try and put it in a perspective of time, and it may have some more meaning to you. It's the JFK's challenge in a historical perspective. That challenge came in May of 1961. For those of you who are history buffs, Alan Shepard flew in 1961, May of 1961. And Kennedy's flight came 3 weeks. Kennedy's challenge came 3 weeks after Alan Shepard's flight. He was the first American in space. He flew for a grand total of 16 minutes. He didn't even get in orbit. John Glenn's flight was a year later. And the fact is, we didn't know it at the time, but those were the first steps that we took to the moon with Shepard's flight. But he truly was the first American in space. And within 3 weeks, the President of the United States stands before Congress and eventually at Rice University, not too long later in Houston, and said just what I repeated earlier: we're going to go to the moon. We're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The technology to accomplish that goal did not exist. 15, 16 minutes of spaceflight experience. And the president says, okay, we're smart enough. That's the challenge that that generation before you, that your parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents inherited from the President of the United States. That was what most of us thought was impossible. And I remember that well because I was a young lieutenant in the Navy. I had just come back from my second cruise in San Diego. And I watched Alan Shepard like every other American, like everybody in the free world did at that time. Remember, we were in a very, very cold war with a combination of countries called the Soviet Union. We had ballistic missiles and atomic bombs pointed at each other from all sectors of the country back and forth. We were in it was a very difficult time internationally. And it was, we needed a hero. And so when Alan Shepard went into space, he was instant hero to every American and to everybody in the free world. And I remember it because, I mean, I look up at this guy and in admiration and respect. I didn't know what to feel. And I remember someone specifically asking me at the time how I might like to do that someday. You know, as I said, I was a young naval aviator. I'd hit a couple hundred carrier landings and, you know, big time, sure, honey, I fly jets kind of thing. I didn't know beans about flying. I had so much to learn yet in my life, 27 years old at the time. Someone said, how would you like to do that? And I said, I'd love to do it. Just give me a chance. But by the time I get good enough, by the time I qualify, by the time I meet all those NASA requirements, there won't be anything left to do. All the pioneering will be over. 10 years, and I want you to remember this, almost 10 years to the month later, I was in the space program. I was Alan Shepard's backup when he was commander of Apollo 14. He stayed with the program, got grounded after his flight because he had an ear infection, but stayed with the program, was committed to fly to the moon. He was commander of Apollo 14, and I was his backup commander, which meant I had to be just as good as him. I had to do everything he was going to do on that flight in a possibility that he might not fly. And when you're backing up Alan Shepard, you know he's going to fly no matter what. But anyway, I had to stand there as the night before he launched to the moon on Apollo 17, or Apollo 14, and we saw all those big spotlights out there on that booster, which was sort of tradition the night before you go, the spotlights. It's just very emotional, very special. You know, that's going to take me to the moon. Only that night, that was going to take him to the moon the next day. And I stood there, not only stood there as his equal, I had already flown twice. I'd walked in space and I'd been to the moon, and Alan Shepard still only had 16 minutes of space flight experience. Don't ever count yourself out. You never know what life has in store. And I learned something that night. I learned something from Alan Shepard just by being in his presence, something about the real meaning of the word commitment, because he truly was committed. And then, very quickly, I've been asked many times, how did I get selected for the space program? Well, I had a choice to make. I was about ready to get out of the Navy, and the Navy says, no, we want to send you to postgraduate school. And I said, oh, why not? I'm having fun flying, if I can still keep flying. And they said, well, you know, you never get something for nothing. For every year of school, you're going to have to give us 2 years back. And I wasn't sure I wanted to make the Navy a career, but I thought, you know, certainly not going to hurt to get a little bit more education. Flying is fun. I don't want to have to go out and work for a living when you can fly. And so I went to postgraduate school, and I was there a couple of years, and then I had plans to take a third year at Princeton, and I was hoping maybe I could go to test pilot school, and maybe I'd stay in the Navy after that, maybe not. Well, while I was in Monterey, California at Naval Postgraduate School, 2 years after Alan Shepard flew, I got a call from the Navy Department saying, we have been screening military people, Navy people, as the Air Force had been doing, and we want to recommend you to NASA for further evaluation. And I said, for what? And they said, for the Apollo program. And I wondered if they had the right guy on the phone, because I really hadn't done much more except get a little bit more education since Shepard flew. And I said, well, not only yes, but heck yes, that's not good enough. We got to know on Monday morning, this is a Friday, got to know by writing, 9 o'clock in the morning, Monday morning in writing. So I said yes. Then I went home and told my wife what I did. But here's the moral of the story. There were still 2,000 or 3,000 civilians applied directly to NASA. The military had recommended 86 of us to NASA for further evaluation. The first thing that happened is I got a pile of paperwork that big, asking me questions and filling out forms about things I knew nothing about. Send all that stuff back in. 2 weeks later, you get another package. I didn't know it, but that was a good sign. I was still involved. Got another package, fill all that stuff out, send it back. Then all of a sudden, you get a telephone call inviting you to Houston, Texas for further evaluation, which meant interviews, more testing, and one thing or another. I went down to Houston, Texas. This is the same guy who still didn't feel he was qualified, still hadn't met NASA's requirements of test pilot school and education. I mean test pilot school and enough jet time. I had a good education, I had a good operational background, and somebody must have thought something of me, or I wouldn't have gotten that far. I went down to Houston, Texas, and I walked into a ballroom at the Rice Hotel, and there were 400. There were no women in the program at that point in time, but there were 400 of the most qualified human beings in the field of aviation that I could ever expect to be in the presence of. They had combat experience. They broke every altitude record. They broke every speed record. They had the best test pilots in this country were in that room for further evaluation, and me. I kept wondering, why am I here? Maybe I'll get to meet John Glenn or Al Shepard. Maybe I'll get to be an astronaut and go home and tell my daughter when she grows up that her daddy met an astronaut. Went through tests, didn't have any. They asked me all about orbital mechanics and astrophysics, things I knew nothing about. And I said this morning, I'm not sure they were looking for answers. They were looking for your approach to those answers. I'll say this. What I learned at Purdue was to learn how to learn. I graduated with an engineering degree and ranked pretty high, but I probably forgot most about what I learned because technology moves so quickly, but I learned how to learn. And so I used my logic and what I learned at Purdue to try and answer these questions I knew nothing about. And they said, thank you. After 4 or 5 days, go home. Don't call us, we'll call you. And I got a call, invite me back down to Houston. And I walked back into that room, and about 3/4 of those can't-miss guys weren't there. And I was. That went on about 2 or 3 times. Ended up having a physical, going back for a physical, 36 people, picked 14 of us, and now I are an astronaut. How do I spell it? And walk the halls with John Glenn and Al Shepard, expected to perform like they did. You talk about a fast track to putting yourself in a different world with a different challenge. But the moral of that story, I go back to what I said a minute ago. Don't ever count yourself out. You never know. Just hang in there. Hang in there. And out of those several thousand to start with, and then 400 in Houston, I was one of 14. What was the chance of that happening to me back then? I wouldn't have given you a nickel and a half for it. Anyway, America let me take it back to those 60s again when Kennedy's challenge, and put it in that historical perspective. America was in something we called the turbulent 60s, which were not very pretty times in this country. We were shackled by civil strife, campus unrest, Getting involved, the beginnings of a very, very unpopular war. Sputnik had flown a few years earlier. Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space, flew just 3 weeks before Alan Shepard flew. We missed being the first space by 3 weeks. The Soviets literally owned space, and we still had a grand total of 16 minutes of suborbital flight. That's why when I refer to Kennedy's challenge to the American people as being deemed almost impossible, that's why. That's the environment, that's the venue we saw ourselves in. But because the American picked up that gauntlet, that challenge, that attitude of don't tell me I can't do it, a few of us, those of us who followed, were given the opportunity where only our dreams have literally taken us in the past, to venture 250,000 miles into the endless blackness of space and time, to see what has never been seen before by human beings. We are now able to call such historic, yet long since forgotten places like Tranquility Base and the Valley of Torres Letro our home. We have looked back seemingly from the far corners of the universe and have now seen ourselves as only in the past. Perhaps we have visualized through the paintings of artists, the words of poets, or perhaps through the minds of philosophers. Let me take you quickly on a verbal trip to the moon. But first, I got to take you to Earth orbit, and if you ever get a chance in your lifetime that someplace you all ought to go, it's an exciting place to be. It's where the shuttle space station flies. I've been there on Gemini 9. You fly at almost 18,000 miles an hour. You circle the globe once every 90 minutes. You see 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets in a 24-hour day here on Earth. You fly over coastlines. You fly over rivers. You fly over lakes, cities, and if you're lucky, you might even get a glimpse of your own hometown. But I want to tell you, when you depart, what I consider the relative safety, notwithstanding the Columbia accident, but the relative safety compared to going to the moon and comfort of our home here in Earth orbit, 200 to 300 miles above the oceans below, I am here to standing here to tell you, you truly do go on a space voyage into the far reaches of outer space, and I promise you it is different. Because it's at that moment that you attain speeds of 25,000 miles an hour. Now I want you to start recalling the pictures of that horizon and that Earth that you saw a little earlier. Taking you beyond the reach, 25,000 miles, eventually taking you beyond the reach of Earth's gravity until you find yourself literally detached from one planet and captured by another somewhere out there in this universe. That horizon, which was just slightly curved in Earth orbit, somehow closes in around upon itself, as you saw in those pictures, creating a strange, but after you look at it, a very, very familiar sight. No longer do you find yourself speeding over oceans and continents in a matter of moments, literally crossing the breadth of North America in less than 15 minutes, but rather now we find ourselves literally peering across the entirety of this Earth of ours, from the turquoise blues of the Caribbean across the East Coast and the windswept Midwest, windswept plains, the deserts and the oceans, into the deep dark blues of the Pacific, and you can do it without even turning your head. It's right there in front of you. You can look from the giant icebergs of the north across to the snow-covered desolation of the mountains that cover our pole to the south. You can now literally see across the entirety of continents. Those magnificently beautiful sunrises and sunsets with their bands of blue and gold, and they are great. When the sun comes up when you're in Earth orbit, it gets sort of bluish, and the blue gets darker, and then there's a band of blue and a lighter blue, and then beneath it the sun starts to wash that out, and then you see the gold of the sun, are magnificently beautiful. And you witness them each revolution. Each revolution as you circle the Earth are now literally seem to be happening before your very eyes, because now you can watch the sunset on the east coast of the United States knowing it's rising on the east coast of Australia, all at the same instance. As I said to Dr. Letterman this morning, it's almost like looking across time in the lives of people rather than across distance. Time is something you really don't understand, and it becomes more of a mystery once you go to the moon. And you do this all while the Earth revolves mysteriously yet majestically on an axis you can't see. Every 12 hours you see the other side of the world. There's no strings holding up. There's no fulcrum like you see on a globe in a library on which this Earth moves. An axis you can't see, but you know must be there. As the Earth turns, North America and South America sort of sneak around the corner. And then comes Australia and Asia and Europe, and then the entire continent of Africa are right there in front of your eyes as you're heading out to the moon. And all this while the world continues to grow small. Wow, very, very, very quickly as you leave the nearness of the Earth, and then more slowly as you approach the moon, until a time comes, you may remember this from the movie Apollo 13, and a time comes when you can literally obscure the entire planet of ours, this star of ours in the heavens, Earth, with nothing bigger than your thumb. You can literally blot out your identity with reality. That's the Earth, that's home, that's love, that's life, that's the future, that's everything you relate to and understand. You can blot out your identity with reality with the palm of your hand. That's what I said. We not only leave this Earth physically, I think we leave this Earth philosophically and spiritually as well. And after 3 short days, almost like a dream, not quite, but you find yourself standing on a moon, and the subject of the landing itself is on my next invitation to come back and talk about. But it's truly a unique experience to be in control of that spacecraft. It's not automatic. Mission control doesn't fly our spacecraft. We put human intelligence in there to make the decisions that have to be made. If Neil Armstrong was a robot, Apollo 11 would have crashed. It would have run out of gas. It would have landed on a boulder. We are able to select our landing sites once we get near that valley we're going to land in, and we make the decisions as to how well we do it. But after 3 short days, you literally land, get out of the spacecraft, and you realize that you are in a valley that has been frozen in time since eternity began, since the beginning of time. You are now looking at something at a mountain range, at a valley, at a place that no human being has ever been before. You're looking at something that has never been seen by human eyes. It was a valley in our case, as you saw, and couldn't really tell the size of them, a valley that was surrounded by mountains that are higher than the Grand Canyon of Arizona is deep. A valley, no matter what the outcome may be, that has now become your home and is destined, in our particular case, for 75 hours to be our own personal little Camelot. It was a valley of overpowering beauty, majestic beyond belief, a valley with no trees, no water, no color, a valley that has been described by many as magnificent desolation, which typifies so much of our moon, which circles this planet every month. There you find yourself shrouded in sunlight, surrounded by the blackest black that you can conceive in your mind. And I'm not talking about darkness. I said blackness, absence of color, absence perhaps of anything. Yet the sunlight is shining through that blackness, but there's nothing for it to shine on until all of a sudden it's a massive 3-dimensional blackness. The endlessness of space, the endlessness of time, the infinity of it all. And I can't put a picture of infinity up there. I can't show it to you. I can't give you a piece of it, but I can tell you the infinity of space and the infinity of time does exist. The endlessness of the universe, of which I had a different perspective of at the time, does exist. I just can't find any other words to describe it. The time is then that you realize that you are truly, truly on a space voyage. Because as I said, it's a paradox. You stand in sunlight and you're surrounded by the blackest black that you can create in your mind. And yet I wonder whether I fully realized where I was at that point in time, in space, in history. It's easy to conclude I did not. That is why I continue to watch in awe the earth. It was dominated by the blues of the oceans and the whites in the clouds. Three-dimensional within that blackness. And if you took time, we're out there on the moon 7, 8 hours at a time, you realize the earth is dynamic, it's moving, it's got energy. It didn't tumble through space. It seemed like it had every right to move aimlessly, but it moved with purpose and logic through the heavens in a manner that defies anybody to describe it in words, reinforcing an undeniable belief that I guess I've had all my life and never really thought too much about, that this earth, this place we call home, is just too beautiful to have happened by accident, that there must be somebody big and somebody bigger than you, somebody bigger than me, who put the small part of the universe together that I was privileged to see at the time. I felt almost as if I was on a plateau where science, as it explains more and more and more to us and will continue to do so in the future, had met its match. Science and technology got me to where I was, but it could not explain either what I was seeing and more particularly what I was feeling and what I couldn't explain to myself. If you want to let your imagination really wander, and this is not meant to be a religious statement, because you can dress your God or dress your God in any way you want and call him by any name you want. But if you can, but spiritually, if you can allow yourself, imagine that you're sitting on God's front porch looking back at a very small part of the universe. That's what it was like to stand on the surface of the moon. Well, never before this epic event, now more than 3 decades ago, we now remember as Apollo, nor sadly ever since, has man dared to venture as far as 250,000 miles in space. Somewhat disappointing to me. I wonder sometimes, did Apollo come before its time? Should it be your generation that takes us to the moon for the first time? Did Apollo come before its time? It's almost like JFK, because of the challenge, because of the events of the 60s, because of the Cold War, decided it was time to reach out into the 21st century, grab a decade at a time, slip it neatly in the 60s and 70s, call it Apollo. We went to the moon, we came home, and then we decided to start over. And that's where we find ourselves today. You know, although we as a nation are destined to, quote, stay home in Earth orbit for the foreseeable future, long after the shuttle returns to flight, I believe without reservation that someday, once again, we will satisfy our insatiable desire to explore and to discover the unknown, the dreams of our forefathers thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. The desire to know and understand something about the unknown are now within the reach of our children. And you are, I don't mean to offend you, you're young men and young women, but you are our children. And the opportunity to learn something about that unknown is now within your reach. And I submit to you, if we give you the opportunity, we give you the tools, we give you the education. Let me put it the other way. You earn the education, and we provide the inspiration for challenge in your hearts and your minds. I submit to you that you will not be denied. Too many years have passed for me to still be the last man to have left my footprints on the surface of the moon. Somewhere, I truly believe that there is a young boy or young girl, maybe one of you, maybe your younger brothers and sisters, the possessor of the indomitable will and courage to someday lift that dubious honor from my shoulders and truly take us back out there where we belong. We now, as a generation, have challenged the future. Those of you who follow in our footsteps have only to understand the significance of that challenge and the time at which it came and the circumstances under which we did the impossible, so that you too can someday determine your own destiny. William Jennings Bryan said it best probably at the turn of the last century when he said, "Destiny is not a matter of chance, rather it's a matter of choice." Now I'm going to close here real quick, and I don't know if we're going to have time for questions or not. It's up to you, with some of my personal thoughts, some Cernanisms, as I decided to call them. First of all, I'm going to urge you all to dream, and to dream the impossible, and to commit yourself to making your dreams come true. I was a youngster during World War II. I was in elementary school. And I think without knowing it, my first steps to the moon were taken with that dream. My dream was to fly airplanes off of aircraft carriers. My hero were the unsung heroes who gave them themselves and their lives and everything else, who made airplanes do the impossible during World War II to keep this a free nation and to keep this a free world. Those were my heroes. So many of them I will never know. That stimulated me to dream the impossible. And I urge you in your world to find your heroes and dream the impossible and make the impossible happen. And it can happen. It does happen. My dreams literally became a passion. And yours also can become a passion. Because I'm telling you, if I can stand here for 40 minutes or an hour and talk to you about having gone to the moon. I went to the moon, in many cases, not only before you were born, but in some cases before your parents were born. I want you to tell me what you cannot do in your lifetime if you really want to do it badly enough. I want you to tell me, and I'll stay here if you want to tell me, what's impossible in your lifetime. If I can go to the moon before you were born, you tell me what's impossible in your lifetime, and I think you're going to have a tough time coming up with that answer. Now, I also want to tell you, don't be afraid to make a mistake. God knows I made a lot of them in my life. Don't make the same mistake twice and, be stupid, but don't be afraid to make a mistake. You're not going to learn if you make a mistake. If you're afraid to make a mistake, you're never going to try. And if you don't try, you'll never succeed. And if you don't try, you'll never know how good you can really be. There's a phrase that goes, these are still Cernanisms, there's a phrase that goes, he who believes, he or she, or let me say this way, a person who believes they can not, person who believes they can't, person who believes they can't do it, is probably right. But so too is a person who believes they can. Person who believes they can't is probably right. Person who believes they can is also probably right. I want to tell you what my dad used to tell me not too far from here when I grew up. He said, I'm only going to ask one thing of you. And he said, I'm only going to ask you to do your best. I don't care whether it's in a classroom, on a football field, trying to play the clarinet, which I wasn't very good at. But just all I'm going to ask of you is to do your best. And there isn't anybody else can ask more of you. Your teachers, your friends cannot ask more of you than to do your best. But there's only one person who knows what their best really is. That's you. You're the one that has to live with yourself. You're the one that has to know whether you're doing your best. And he said, you're not going to be better than everybody else at everything. And I wasn't. But he said, sooner or later, your best is going to rise to the top. My biggest dream now, quite frankly, I had a dream about flying airplanes. My dad had a dream about me getting the education that he never had an opportunity to do. Those dreams were not in conflict. Those dreams were in concert. Those dreams allowed me to do what I do and allowed me to stand here and tell you I called the moon my home. But my biggest dream today is to see you live your dreams. And anything I can do to encourage that to happen, I will do. The final thought is always shoot for the moon. And everything you do, shoot for the moon. Give it your all. Do your best. Always shoot for the moon. Because even if you miss, you're going to land somewhere out there among the stars. God bless and thank you, and taking a lot of your time. Thank you.